The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the highway onto the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. It was October 2003, early autumn, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the city. I was 28, living alone in Seattle, and desperate for a break from the noise, the rush, the constant hum of life that left me exhausted but restless. The cabin was a rental, deep in the woods of northern Oregon, about a 2-hour drive from Portland. I had found it online, an old wooden structure sitting on the edge of a thick forest near a small, quiet lake. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell. It was a mix of wet wood, damp earth, and something faintly like smoke, like the cabin had been closed up for a long time and was only now waking up. The dirt road ended in a small clearing where the cabin stood, surrounded by tall pines whose tops disappeared into a thick fog that had rolled in overnight. The cabin itself was rough but sturdy, built maybe in the 70s, with peeling brown paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dusty, clouded with grime and spiderwebs. I parked my car next to the porch and grabbed my backpack and cooler. The air was cold, the kind that creeps through your jacket and makes you aware of every small breath you take. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale air and old wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were lined with wood paneling that had yellowed with age. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a worn-out table with 2 chairs, and a living space with a threadbare couch and a fireplace full of cold ashes. I dropped my bags and went to the windows, looking out into the forest. The fog had thickened, blurring the trees and hiding the lake from view. The cabin had no cell signal, no internet, and no TV, exactly what I wanted. I was here to disconnect, to find some peace. After unpacking my things, I went to explore the surroundings. A narrow path led from the back of the cabin down to the lake. The water was still, dark, and cold-looking. Leaves floated on its surface, and the air was so quiet I could hear the faint splash of a fish breaking the water far away. I spent the day unpacking, chopping some wood for the fireplace, and trying to get comfortable. The cabin was simple but had what I needed: a bed, a small bathroom with a shower, and a wood stove to heat the place if it got too cold at night. As evening came, the fog grew thicker and crept closer to the cabin. I lit the stove, filling the room with a faint smell of smoke and warmth. Outside, the woods were alive with sounds: rustling leaves, distant birds, the occasional snap of a twig. It was calming but also made me aware of how isolated I was. No other houses, no people, nothing but trees stretching for miles. I cooked some canned soup on the stove and ate quietly by the window. The light inside the cabin was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the fog seemed to press against the glass, softening the edges of the trees and hiding the world beyond. That night, I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispered through the branches, and at one point, I heard a low, distant howl, maybe a coyote or a wolf. It wasn't frightening, just a reminder of the wildness surrounding me. I fell asleep with the stove warming the room and the fog wrapping the cabin like a blanket. The next day was clear, bright with sunlight piercing through the trees. I decided to hike deeper into the forest, taking the path that followed the edge of the lake. The trail was narrow, lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks, and the ground was soft underfoot. I saw deer tracks in the mud and the occasional squirrel darting through the branches. I carried a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a map I had printed before coming. The map wasn't very detailed, but showed the main paths and a few landmarks, including an old logging road not far from the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Old, rusted metal objects half buried in the dirt, fragments of wire, parts of machinery, and broken glass. It looked like someone had been here years ago, maybe for logging or mining. The forest was reclaiming it all, but the signs of human activity were faint but there. After a couple of hours, I reached a clearing with an old foundation made of large stones, maybe the remains of a cabin or small building. The wood was long gone, but nails and bits of broken glass were scattered around. I walked through carefully, noticing how the area was overgrown with weeds and vines. The silence here was heavier, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't stay long and headed back before the sun got too low. When I got back to the cabin, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The woods looked darker, the trees more like black shadows. I lit the stove again and tried to relax with a book, but my thoughts kept drifting. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over the ground. It was slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening, but I couldn't see anything through the window except the dense fog. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and the forest went silent again. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch or an animal moving through the undergrowth. Still, it made me a little uneasy. The next morning, I found marks outside near the edge of the clearing. Deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. They led into the forest, disappearing between the trees. The grooves were fresh. The earth was still loose. I spent the day checking the perimeter, but I didn't see any other signs. The forest was quiet, and the cabin looked the same, but the feeling of being watched was growing. I kept the windows closed tight and kept a small hatchet near the door. The third night was worse. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, closer. It circled the cabin slowly, stopping sometimes, then moving again. I didn't dare open the door or look outside. I stayed huddled near the stove, the hatchet in my hand, the cabin dark except for the small orange glow. At one point, the dragging stopped just outside the door. I could hear heavy breathing, low and slow. My heart pounded. After a long silence, the sound moved away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I noticed the back door had a long scratch mark, like claws trying to tear through the wood. The scratches were deep, jagged, and fresh. There was dirt and some hair stuck in the marks, coarse, dark, not human. Fear hit me hard, but I stayed calm. I knew the cabin was isolated, but it had a door and windows. I checked my supplies and decided I needed to get out the next day. That afternoon, I made sure the car was ready, packed everything, and prepared for the drive back. I wanted to leave before nightfall. As evening came, the fog was almost thick enough to cut with a knife. The sounds outside were different now, low growls, rustling that was faster and more purposeful. I sat near the window, watching the dark forest, waiting for the last light. Then I heard it, a deep growl, low and long, coming from just beyond the porch. I grabbed the hatchet and slowly stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, two glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the clearing. The creature was large, much bigger than any dog or wolf I had seen. Its fur was matted, dark, and wet, and its teeth glinted in the dim light. I backed toward the cabin, heart racing. The animal didn't move but growled again, low and threatening. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I could hear it pacing outside, its heavy breathing and low growls pressing against the wood. I turned on the porch light, hoping to scare it away, but the creature just stopped and stared, unmoved. Night fell fully, and the cabin felt like a small island in a sea of danger. I stayed by the window, watching the shadows move, ready to defend myself. Morning came with a thin, weak sun. The creature was gone, but outside the porch were deep paw prints, big and muddy. I wasted no time. I packed the last things, started the car, and drove away, not looking back. The road was long and winding, but the feeling of relief grew with every mile. The forest stayed behind me, dense and silent. When I got home, I called the rental company and told them about what happened. They said the area was known for a large population of wild bears, and sometimes one or two got bold enough to come near cabins. Looking back, I realized the dragging sounds, the scratches, the growls. It was a bear, maybe a big male, territorial and desperate for food before winter. It wasn't a ghost or a myth. It was nature, wild and real, and I had been lucky to get away safe. The experience taught me how quickly the wilderness could turn from peaceful to dangerous. I still think about that cabin, the quiet lake, and the foggy nights, but now I know respect for the forest means knowing what lives there. not just in stories, but in real. I went on a solo camping trip back in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, living in Boise, Idaho. I'd always liked being outdoors, especially in places where I couldn't hear cars or people, where the only sounds were wind, trees creaking, and birds moving through the branches. That summer, I had a long weekend off from work and decided to head into a section of forest about 3 hours north of the city. It wasn't a national park, just public land with some fire roads and a few hiking trails. Not too many people went there because there weren't any campgrounds or amenities. That was part of the appeal. I didn't want to share the woods with anyone. I loaded my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, tools, first aid kit, all the usual stuff. I'd done enough trips like this to know what I needed. I had a paper map and a compass too, since I didn't plan on having cell signal out there. My plan was to park off a Forest Service road and hike a few miles in, set up camp by a creek I remembered from a trip a couple of years back, and stay 2 nights. The area had a lot of pine and fir trees, big slopes, and not much undergrowth, so walking off-trail wasn't hard. I figured I'd be completely alone. I started hiking mid-morning and reached the spot I had in mind by early afternoon. The creek was still there, shallow and clear, with smooth rocks under the water. I found a flat spot just above the bank to pitch my tent, with tall trees on all sides and a soft bed of pine needles. It felt good to get the pack off my back. I drank some water, set up my shelter, and got a small fire going. The air smelled like sap and smoke. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. Nothing but squirrels and a few birds moving around in the branches. That first night was peaceful. I stayed up by the fire until it burned down to embers, then climbed into my sleeping bag. It was colder than I expected, but I'd brought the right gear. I drifted off to the sounds of the water and the occasional creak of trees in the wind. I didn't wake up once. The next morning, I made instant coffee and oatmeal, then decided to explore farther upstream. I had the whole day and nowhere to be. I followed the creek for maybe an hour, just taking my time, moving slow and looking around. I saw animal tracks in the soft dirt along the banks. Mostly deer, maybe a fox or coyote. At one point, I heard something moving in the trees uphill from me. I stopped and waited, not making a sound. It went quiet after a few seconds. Probably just a deer. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. I turned around before noon and headed back to camp. I didn't want to be gone too long in case the weather changed. When I got back, everything looked fine. My tent was still standing. Nothing had been touched. I sat by the fire pit and made lunch, just a tortilla with peanut butter and a few pieces of jerky. I stayed around camp the rest of the day, reading a paperback I'd brought and watching the trees. A couple of times I thought I heard faint noises out in the woods, but they were soft and far off. Could have been branches falling or small animals moving. The kind of sounds you get used to out there. I went to bed early that night. It got dark fast, and the clouds covered the moon. I zipped myself into my bag and listened to the creek again, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I had that weird sense, like when you forget if you locked your front door, just a little off. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. Then I woke up. It was still dark, but not pitch black. My watch said it was just after 3 a.m. I didn't hear anything at first, just the creek. But then I realized something had pulled me out of sleep. I held my breath and listened. There was a soft crunch outside, like a footstep, then another, slow, steady. I stayed completely still. I didn't bring a gun, but I had a knife. I kept it close when I camped alone. I slid my hand toward it slowly, trying not to make any noise. The steps got closer. Whoever it was, if it was a person, they were moving around the tent, not fast, not trying to hide, just circling. I didn't hear talking or breathing, just the crunch of needles underfoot. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. If someone was messing around my camp in the middle of the night without a light or a word, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Then the steps stopped. Silence. I waited, gripping the knife, breathing as slow as I could. I didn't hear anything for what felt like 10 minutes, just the wind in the trees and the trickle of the creek. Then the steps started again, farther off this time, heading away from the tent. They faded into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep again. When the sun came up, I got out fast. I checked around the tent. No footprints, but the ground was dry and covered in needles, so that didn't surprise me. Nothing was missing or disturbed, but I knew what I'd heard. I packed everything quickly. I thought about leaving then, but the rational part of my brain told me it could have been an animal, maybe even a deer. The slow steps, the circling, it didn't feel like a deer. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I'd set up something to keep watch. A trip line maybe, or some kind of signal if someone came near. I moved my tent closer to the creek, where the trees were thinner and I had more visibility. I rigged up a simple perimeter with a few tin cups and sticks from my gear, placed so they'd fall and clatter if someone walked through. Not much, but it made me feel better. I kept my knife on me all day and stayed close to camp. No hikes. I didn't hear anything strange that afternoon. No steps, no movement. That evening, I built up the fire more than usual and let it burn late. When I finally got into the tent, I left the rain flap open just a bit so I could see out and hear better. I stayed awake a long time just listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was quiet. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. Then the noise came again. Not footsteps this time, just the sound of one of the tin cups falling and bouncing once on the ground. My eyes opened instantly. I stayed still, listening. No wind, no other sounds, just that one clink of metal. I waited. After a minute or two, I heard a soft shuffle, like someone crouching or shifting their weight. I reached for the knife again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to look, to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight, but I didn't. I kept still. After what felt like forever, I heard the shuffle again, farther off, then silence. I waited until dawn. When I got out, I found one of the cups on the ground, about 5 feet from where I'd strung it up. The stick it had been hanging on was broken. Nothing else looked touched, but that confirmed it. Someone had come back. Someone was watching my camp. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat or even fill my water. I just got my bag on and started walking. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the woods toward the road. I didn't want to risk running into whoever it was if they were still watching. The hike was rough. I kept looking over my shoulder, pausing to listen every few minutes. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. It took me almost 4 hours to get back to my truck. When I reached it and saw it untouched, a wave of relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. I unlocked it, tossed my pack in, and drove out without stopping. Back in Boise, I told a friend what had happened, just the basics. He thought it might have been a hunter or some drifter, maybe just curious. But there was nothing in my camp worth stealing. No damage, no obvious purpose. That's what got to me. Whoever it was didn't take anything. They didn't say anything. They just watched. That was my last solo trip. I still go camping, but I stick to busier places now. Campgrounds with other people nearby. Sometimes I'll hear footsteps outside my tent at night. Just someone walking to the bathroom or grabbing something from their car. Normal stuff. But every time it happens, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. I wait, holding my breath, listening to see if they stop, if they start circling. I know most people wouldn't think much of it. No one got hurt. Nothing happened, technically, but that's exactly what makes it worse. The not knowing, the silence, the cup falling in the dark and nothing else. I think about it sometimes when I'm lying in bed, when the house is quiet and the neighborhood's asleep. I imagine those footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the walls of my tent, and I wonder how long they stood there, how long they watched, and why. I'll never go that deep into the woods alone again. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the northern part of Idaho. It was July 2021, and I had just taken time off from a job I'd been grinding at for nearly 8 years without a proper break. I'd been feeling burned out and irritable all the time, and I thought being alone in the woods, away from emails and traffic and other people, might help straighten my head out. I didn't want campgrounds or RV parks or anything like that. I wanted real isolation. Just a tent, my pack, and a few days of total quiet. I found a spot on satellite maps that seemed perfect, about 15 miles off any major road, not marked with any trails. Just a small clearing next to a winding creek that eventually fed into the Salmon River. The access road wasn't even on the GPS. It was more of an old fire trail than a road, overgrown and barely wide enough for my truck. But it was manageable. I parked in a small pull-off about half a mile from where the trail vanished into the forest and loaded up my pack. It was hot and dry, and the hike in wasn't easy. I was sweating through my shirt within 10 minutes, and the bugs were bad in the thicker brush. But the woods were beautiful. Tall lodgepole pines, long stretches of dry needles underfoot, birds everywhere. The further I got from the road, the more the quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. It was the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. The clearing was even better than it looked on the map. Maybe 50 yards across, hemmed in by dense forest on 3 sides, and a rocky creek curving around the 4th. The sound of water was constant, clean, steady. No trash, no fire rings, no signs anyone else had camped there. Just silence and wildness. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to hear the creek but far enough not to get wet if it rained. I kept things simple: 1-person tent, sleeping pad, bag, stove, some freeze-dried meals, and a water filter. I brought a bare canister for food, and I stored it 100 feet from the tent like you're supposed to. I spent that first evening walking around, checking out the terrain, gathering deadfall wood for a fire. I wasn't planning to burn much, but the fire gave me something to look at, something to do with my hands. The temperature dropped fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. I sat beside the fire, listening to the insects hum in the trees and watching shadows creep slowly across the clearing. When it got too dark to see my hand in front of my face, I crawled into the tent and lay back on my bag, letting my mind empty out. That first night was peaceful. I woke up once to pee, and the stars were so bright it looked fake. No clouds, no moon, just black sky and cold air and 1,000 points of light over the treetops. I remember thinking it was the quietest I'd ever heard the world. The next morning, I filtered water from the creek and made instant oatmeal. I decided to follow the creek upstream for a while just to explore. I brought my day pack, a knife, a flashlight, and a few snacks. I wasn't expecting to be gone long. The creek ran uphill through a narrow gully, and I had to cross it a few times, hopping from rock to avoid getting wet. I saw elk tracks, scat, even what looked like cougar prints in the mud, though I wasn't completely sure. The sun filtered through the trees in shifting patterns, and the further I walked, the less I thought about work or my phone or any of that crap. I followed the creek maybe 2 miles before turning around. On the way back, I saw something weird. A tree, maybe 20 feet tall, stripped of all its bark on one side. The wood underneath was torn and gouged, almost like claw marks, but not clean. More like chunks had been ripped off by something. There were splinters on the ground. I bent down and looked at it, trying to figure out if it was a bear marking its territory or something else. But it looked too aggressive for that, like something had been trying to break the tree apart. There were also prints nearby, boot prints. Not mine. Someone else had been walking there recently, but they were deep, like the person was heavy or carrying something big. I suddenly felt exposed, standing there in the trees, far from camp, far from my truck. I listened, but heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement, not even birds. That silence made the hairs on my neck stand up. I made my way back to camp faster than before, checking behind me now and then. Nothing followed me. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. The tent, the fire pit, even the wood I'd gathered. Still, I felt off. Not scared, exactly, just unsettled. I kept turning around, thinking I'd see someone standing just beyond the trees. I didn't, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I didn't make a fire. I cooked in silence, eating with my back to a tree so I could see the clearing. I didn't hear anything strange, but every little snap or rustle made me twitch. At some point, I realized the insects had gone quiet again. No crickets, no frogs, just the creek and the sound of my own breath. I went to bed early but didn't sleep much. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a noise. Not a branch falling or an animal walking. Something sharper, like metal clinking against metal. I froze, listening. Then it came again. Faint, distant, but real. A sound you don't expect in the woods. Stopped, then started again. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and peeked out. There was nothing in the clearing. No lights, no movement. I waited 5 minutes, then got out, barefoot, and crept toward the trees. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, back the way I'd come earlier that day. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was regular. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. I stood there for what felt like half an hour, not moving until it finally stopped. I didn't go back to sleep. The next day, I packed everything up. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things, but I knew better. That sound wasn't an animal. It was a person doing something. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker, but something felt wrong. I loaded my gear and hiked back toward the truck. The trail looked different on the way out. Bushes bent the wrong way, branches freshly broken. At one point, I found a boot print on the trail, but it was pointing toward my camp. Not away. That was enough. I kept moving. When I got to where I'd parked, the first thing I noticed was that my truck wasn't how I'd left it. The driver's door was open just an inch. I know I locked it. I always do. I dropped my pack and ran the last few steps. Nothing looked stolen, but someone had been inside. Glove box open, papers scattered, like they were looking for something. I checked under the truck, behind it, everywhere. No one was there. I jumped in and started the engine without thinking. The moment it turned over, I backed out of the brush and drove until I hit pavement. Then another 2 hours before I stopped to breathe. A week later, I reported it to the sheriff in that county. He didn't seem surprised. Said that part of the forest sometimes attracts off-grid squatters or guys running illegal grow-ops. He said the signs I saw, tree damage, prints, my truck being tampered with, sounded like someone trying to scare me off. He told me I was lucky they hadn't done worse. I haven't gone back since. I still camp sometimes, but only in known places. Trailheads, state parks, places with rangers and other people nearby. I miss the quiet sometimes, the true stillness of that forest. But I also remember the silence that came with it. Not peaceful, but dead. Like something was watching and waiting. What really gets to me is that I never saw whoever it was. Never heard them speak. Never found a campsite or trash or anything. Just signs. Just a few things left behind to let me know I was not alone. And that was enough. I wasn't the kind of person who usually went out to the woods alone. My friends often joked about my nervousness when it came to being in the middle of nowhere, but after weeks of pressure from them, I finally agreed to spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods. It seemed harmless enough, a quiet break away from work, a little peace and solitude. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, off the grid, just the way the owners liked it. It sounded like an escape, and at first, that's all I wanted. I had just turned 29. I had a decent job, a few friends, and a lot of stress that needed to be shaken off. It was late October, just before the snow would start to fall, and the chill in the air had already begun. My car pulled into the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, its tires crunching over the dry, brittle leaves. Trees lined both sides of the road, their trunks dark and twisted, reaching up into the sky like skeletal hands. A cold wind rustled through the branches, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling a little uneasy, but that was normal, right? I'd rented the cabin through a small, local agency. The ad had been vague, only offering the basics: a small, one-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, a view of a nearby lake, and no other houses for miles. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace. The perfect retreat. As I parked and grabbed my bags from the back of the car, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that seems almost unnatural. The kind that makes you realize how much noise is around you all the time, even when you're not paying attention. There were no birds chirping, no sounds of traffic, just an almost suffocating silence. I locked the car, grabbed the key from under the mat, and made my way to the front door of the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the wood cold under my hand. Inside, the place was exactly as I'd expected, rustic but comfortable. A large stone fireplace sat in the center of the living room, with a small couch and a few wooden chairs scattered around. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the scent of pine and old wood filled the air. The windows overlooked a small, mist-covered lake, the surface of the water smooth and glassy, reflecting the gray sky above. A chill seemed to settle in the room as I took a deep breath. This place was going to be great, I thought, just what I needed. I unpacked my bags and started a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered and crackled as I sat down in the armchair, settling in for a night of reading and relaxation. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the only light in the cabin came from the fire and a single dim lamp near the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches scratching against the walls of the cabin, making the house feel even more isolated. Around midnight, I heard a noise, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, unsettling sound, but it was enough to make me pause. I sat up straight, listening carefully. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, the only other sound in the room. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, or maybe an animal outside. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. An hour later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, like something was definitely moving outside. The sound was slow, deliberate, like footsteps dragging through the leaves. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The mist had thickened, and the lake was barely visible now, shrouded in fog. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with the weight of the wind. I didn't see anything moving, but the sense of being watched crept up my spine. I backed away from the window and walked over to the door. It was locked, the deadbolt securely in place. I could feel my pulse quickening as the silence settled in again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal had wandered too close to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check the windows again, but this time, I heard a loud thud. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. The thud was heavy, like something large had bumped into the side of the house. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved cautiously toward the back door. I shined the light through the window, scanning the dark yard behind the cabin. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, just outside the pool of light from the cabin. It was hard to make out, just a shadowy shape against the trees, but there was no mistaking the feeling of being watched. My mind raced. Was it a person? A man? I had to be imagining it, right? Maybe it was just a trick of the light or the trees playing games with my eyes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. I had come here to get away from everything, but now all I wanted was to leave. I grabbed my coat and ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone had just hit the wall. I froze. What the hell was going on? I turned, my eyes scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The fireplace poker. I grabbed it and held it tight, my hand shaking. There was no way I was going outside to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The banging came again, louder this time, and I could feel the walls of the cabin shaking from the force of it. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. I moved back to the window and looked out, but there was no one there. The figure had disappeared, but the noise continued. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The hours dragged on, but the banging didn't stop. Came in waves, each one more frantic than the last. I was trapped, my only thought now being how to survive the night. I wasn't sure if I could even make it until morning. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take a break from work and spend some time in the woods. I was 34 then, single, working as a freelance graphic designer in Chicago. I had been burned out from nonstop deadlines and screen time. A friend had told me about this quiet area in northern Minnesota, somewhere near Ely, where he used to go fishing as a kid. There was a cabin there his uncle once owned, but it had been empty for years. He said it was old, no electricity, no running water, but still solid. I could use it for free if I wanted. It sounded perfect to me. I packed up my old SUV with what I thought I'd need. A couple coolers of food, a camping stove, sleeping bag, lanterns, batteries, clothes for cold weather, and some books. I also brought a hatchet and a folding saw in case I needed to chop firewood. It was supposed to be cold that week, dropping into the 30s at night. I printed directions and loaded my phone with maps in case I lost signal, which I expected to happen once I was deep into the woods. The drive was long, nearly 10 hours from the city. The further north I went, the more remote things got. Gas stations became rare. Towns got smaller. By the time I passed through Ely, the last town on the route, it was early afternoon. The road turned to gravel not long after, winding through thick pine and birch forest. I followed the directions carefully. At one point, I had to leave the main road entirely and follow an unmarked dirt trail. It was barely wide enough for my vehicle, and the trees scratched against the sides of the car as I crept along. Eventually, I came to a clearing where the cabin sat just like he'd described. It was old, with gray, weather-beaten wood and a sagging metal roof. The windows were covered in grime, but intact. The door stuck when I tried to open it, but I shoved it hard and it gave. Inside, it was one room with a small wood stove, a dusty old cot, some shelves, and a table with 2 chairs. Rodent droppings were in the corners, and there was a musky smell, but it was solid and dry. I opened all the windows to air it out. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. I swept out the dirt and leaves, knocked down cobwebs, and wiped off the surfaces. I checked for leaks or rot and didn't see any. There was a pile of chopped wood outside, dry under a makeshift lean-to. I brought some in and lit a fire in the stove before the sun went down. It got dark fast out there. There was no light pollution, just blackness beyond the windows and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern light until I got tired, then crawled into my sleeping bag on the cot. The silence was overwhelming. In the city, there's always some background noise, cars, sirens, people. Here, it was just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I drifted off after a while, but woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound. It was like a slow dragging or scraping noise coming from outside. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer walking through the brush. After a few minutes, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading away from the clearing, barely visible under the fallen leaves. I followed it for a while and found a small frozen-over pond about half a mile in. There were no footprints or signs of people, just quiet woods and the sound of distant birds. Felt peaceful. That afternoon, I collected more wood, boiled water from a nearby stream for drinking, and cooked a simple meal on the camping stove. I had brought a small solar battery for my phone, but I kept it off most of the time to conserve power. There was no signal anyway. I read a bit, jotted down some sketches, and sat outside with a blanket wrapped around me until it got too cold. Again, I built up the fire before bed. That second night, I heard the noise again, scraping, slow, like something being dragged across the ground. Came from the left side of the cabin this time. I turned off the lantern and stood by the window, peeking through a small gap in the curtain. I couldn't see anything. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound stopped again after a few minutes. I told myself it had to be a raccoon or porcupine. Maybe a branch had fallen. But I noticed something in the morning, tracks. Not paw prints, but drag marks. 2 of them parallel, starting at the tree line and ending near the cabin wall. Then they just stopped. I went out to look closer. The ground was covered in leaves, but I could tell something had been pulled or dragged through them. I looked around but didn't find anything. No animal, no object, no broken branches. I brushed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The third night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I sat by the window with the lantern turned low, wrapped in a blanket, listening. For hours, nothing happened. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. That dragging sound, slow and steady, from the back side of the cabin. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the back door quietly. I stepped out onto the cold porch, heart pounding. I moved the light slowly across the trees. Nothing. I walked a few steps toward the woods. Still nothing. But the dragging had stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Eventually, I went back inside. When I woke up in the morning, there were new drag marks on the other side of the cabin. Same parallel lines, same end point. It was like someone or something was circling the place at night. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to. I hadn't seen anything. Could still be an animal. Maybe a bear dragging a carcass. Maybe an old trap or cable had gotten pulled by wind. I didn't want to panic over nothing. That day, I explored further down the trail near the pond. I figured it would help clear my head. The sky was overcast and the air felt damp. After about a mile, I found something I hadn't seen before. A second cabin, older and smaller than mine. It was half collapsed, covered in vines and moss. The door hung open, and one wall had caved in. It looked abandoned for decades. Inside, there were rusted tools, broken furniture, and a shattered mirror. Something about it felt off. The place was hidden, like someone had built it to disappear. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. That night, I placed small sticks upright around the cabin walls, spaced out in a circle. If anything came close, it would knock them over. I also brought the hatchet inside and kept it next to the cot. The fire burned hot, but I didn't sleep much. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the dragging again. I held my breath and listened. This time, it moved around the cabin slowly, like something circling deliberately. After about 20 minutes, it stopped. I didn't dare go outside. In the morning, some of the sticks were knocked over on the east side. The drag marks were there again. And this time, I noticed something else. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly next to the wall, like someone had left them there intentionally. That was it. I decided I was leaving the next morning. I spent the rest of that day packing up. I left the place as clean as I could. I tried not to think about the other cabin, or the noises, or the drag marks. That night, I kept the fire going and stayed fully dressed in case I had to leave suddenly. I barely slept. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the wall. Not scratching or dragging, tapping. Rhythmic like a knock. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then again. I sat up and listened, too afraid to move. Then silence. I stayed like that until sunrise. When it was light enough, I loaded the last of my things into the car and left. The road out felt narrower than before. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and even then I didn't breathe easy until I reached Ely. Back in Chicago, I tried to make sense of what happened. I looked at maps, tried to find that second cabin on satellite view, but nothing showed up. I didn't tell anyone about the drag marks or the knocks. I just said the place was too remote and I needed a hot shower. It's been years now, and I still think about that trip. I still don't know what was out there. Maybe it was a person living off-grid. Maybe it was a hunter or some reclusive squatter. But it wasn't random. The drag marks, the sticks, the rocks, they were placed on purpose. Someone was watching the cabin at night. Maybe they were trying to scare me off. If that was their goal, it worked. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. I still love the woods, but I stick to campgrounds now. Places with other people around, lights, even security cameras. I learned something out there in Minnesota. The scariest things aren't always loud or violent. Sometimes, it's what stays quiet, just outside the window, waiting for you to fall asleep. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the backwoods of northern Idaho. It was July 2017, and I had just wrapped up a heavy few months of freelance design work, staring at screens for 10 to 12 hours a day. I was burned out and needed to be away from everything. Phones, cars, people. I wanted to feel like I didn't exist for a while, like I was completely removed from the constant notifications and noise. I chose a place called Dead Horse Creek. It was a stretch of forest tucked between two ridges, far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't hear or see anyone for days. I'd read about it in an old forum post where someone mentioned it was as quiet as you can get without stepping into Canada. That sounded perfect to me. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a tent, a sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a water filter, extra clothes, a hatchet, a small camp stove, a couple knives, a flashlight, and my GPS with extra batteries. I also brought a topo map and compass just in case the electronics failed. I made sure to tell my brother where I was going and when I'd be back. I planned to hike out, set up camp for 4 days and hike back. Nothing fancy, just isolation. The first day went smooth. I drove my truck as far as the dirt road would let me, then loaded my pack and headed in. The hike was beautiful: green pines, low ferns, and the kind of clean air that only exists miles from pavement. I passed along the creek bed for about 4 miles before settling on a spot about 30 yards from the water. It was flat and shaded, but open enough to not feel claustrophobic. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, filtered some water, and sat down on a log to eat dinner while the sun slipped behind the trees. That first night was uneventful, just the usual forest sounds: crickets, wind, maybe a branch cracking under an animal's foot somewhere far off. I fell asleep easily, grateful for the escape. The second day, I explored. I walked upstream for about 2 miles and found a natural pool, deep and cold. I took a swim, careful not to slip on the rocks. The sun warmed me up fast afterward, and I dried off lying on a boulder. That night, I cooked rice and beans on the little stove and watched the stars come out. No problems, no stress. I felt like I'd made the right decision. It was the third night when things changed. I had gone to bed early, maybe around 9 p.m. The sky had been cloudy, and I was tired from a long hike I took earlier in the day that had me bushwhacking up one of the ridges. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees and woke up maybe 2 hours later to a different sound. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just the feeling that the normal forest sounds had stopped. No bugs, no rustling, nothing. Just the breeze, which had picked up a little. I opened my eyes and lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The silence was too complete, like everything had frozen. Then I heard a snap. It was close, too close. Not like a branch falling far away, but like someone stepping on a stick maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I held my breath and stayed still, trying to process. Could be a deer, I told myself. Maybe even a moose. But the steps weren't random or fast. They were slow, deliberate. Step, crunch, pause, another step, then nothing. I sat up quietly, heart beating harder now. I pulled my flashlight from beside my sleeping bag but didn't turn it on yet. The walls of the tent were too thin to see through, so I just waited, trying to hear more. Couple minutes passed with nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out. Pitch black. Cloud cover blocked the moon, and the trees made everything darker. I still didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to give away my position if it was someone out there. I listened hard. Still nothing. Then a soft rustling, like something brushing against low branches, maybe 15 feet away. Then a grunt, quiet but not animal-like. It sounded human, like someone catching their breath while crouching or shifting their weight. I froze. My body wanted to panic, but I stayed low and crawled out of the tent, moving slow and quiet to the other side, putting the tent between me and the sound. I crouched there, waiting. More silence. Then, after maybe 5 minutes, a long, dragging sound like a stick or a foot being pulled through leaves and dirt. It moved laterally across the front of my tent. I didn't dare move. After a few more minutes, it was gone. I waited another 20, maybe 30 minutes before moving. I slowly circled back toward the creek and filled my Nalgene just for something to do. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to think. Could it have been someone hunting? Possible, but unlikely this far in. Maybe a lost hiker? But the movements didn't sound confused. They sounded careful, too careful. Eventually, I went back to the tent, but I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me flinch. I kept my knife in hand and the flashlight on my chest. The sun couldn't rise fast enough. By morning, the forest sounded normal again. Birds were chirping, the creek was bubbling. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the unease. I got up, packed my gear, and decided I'd move camp further upstream, somewhere with better visibility and fewer thick brush lines nearby. As I was packing, I noticed something I hadn't before. A boot print. It wasn't mine. Too large. Wide toe. Deep heel. It had been pressed into the soft dirt near a tree about 10 feet from my tent. The tread was different from my hiking boots. It looked older, like something from a work boot or logger boot, not a modern brand. And it was facing my camp, not away from it. That sealed it. I moved. I hiked about 2 miles upstream and found a spot on a gentle slope with a view down to the creek. It was rockier but safer, I thought. Harder to approach quietly. I set up again, this time more carefully. I cleared brush in a 15-foot radius, hung a few small noise traps using fishing line and tin lids, and kept my pack by my side instead of inside the tent. I figured if something happened again, I could grab and go. That evening, I skipped cooking. I ate granola bars and jerky and kept the fire small, more for morale than warmth. I stayed awake longer, watching the trees and listening. I didn't hear anything unusual, and by midnight I crawled into the tent and tried to rest. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. There was no sound this time, just a feeling, that same oppressive silence as the night before. I sat up, knife already in hand, and waited. Then I heard it. A soft crunch, but not on leaves. On rock, somewhere to my right, maybe 20 feet away. Then a slow, careful step. Another, then silence. My traps didn't make noise, which meant whoever or whatever it was came in from a different angle. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and flashlight, crawled out, and crept into the trees opposite the noise. I found a spot between 2 fallen logs and lay low, watching. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. After about 10 minutes, a faint shape moved through the darkness near my tent. I couldn't see it clearly, just that it was tall, definitely a person. They moved slowly around the tent, stopping once or twice to bend down, like they were inspecting something. Then, to my surprise, they moved away, not toward the creek, but back up the slope and into the woods. I waited another 15 minutes before moving. I went back to the tent, broke it down fast, stuffed everything into the pack and left. I didn't even care about leaving trash behind. I just needed to go. I hiked fast, headlamp off most of the time, using my compass to stay oriented. It was the longest night of my life. I didn't stop until daylight. By then, I was miles from the original site, exhausted and sore. I found a patch of ground near a rock outcropping and took a short nap while the sun rose. Then I kept hiking until I hit the dirt road and eventually made it back to the truck. I didn't look back once. I never reported it. What could I even say? That I heard something and saw a vague shape? That someone walked near my tent? There wasn't any crime, technically. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. That wasn't just some lost camper. They were watching me, moving slow, careful, patient. I haven't camped alone since then. I still go out sometimes, but only with others and never too deep. I stick to state parks and marked trails. I still think about it sometimes when I lie awake at night. I wonder who they were, what they wanted, if they were just curious or something worse. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is that there are parts of the forest where the silence means something, where the usual rules don't apply, where someone might be watching, not ghosts or monsters, but people, real people with real intentions. And that's the scariest thing of all. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the summer of 2022. I lived in Southern Oregon at the time, in a small town called Glendale, working remotely as a freelance survey technician. Most of my days were spent staring at maps and topography lines on a screen. I had gone camping a few times growing up, mostly with my uncle and cousins, but never truly by myself. That summer, I'd been feeling burnt out and anxious from the isolation of working from home, and I thought being out in nature for a few days might help clear my head. I didn't want to go anywhere too crowded or well-known. After doing some searching online, I came across an old blog post about a place called Little Rock Lake, deep in the Fremont-Winema National Forest. The article mentioned that it was remote, not maintained anymore by the Forest Service, and rarely visited. That was perfect for what I wanted: peace and quiet, no cell service, and a chance to completely disconnect. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers of food and water, a portable stove, some basic fishing gear, bear spray, a knife, and an emergency satellite beacon just in case. I also brought a paper map of the area since I couldn't rely on my phone out there. It was a 3-hour drive from Glendale, most of it on back roads, and the last stretch was a winding dirt path full of potholes and fallen branches. I didn't see another car for nearly an hour once I turned off the highway. When I finally reached the spot marked on the map, there wasn't much to it. A clearing just big enough to park the truck, and a faint path that led into the trees. No signage, no designated campsites, just a thinning of pine trees and an overgrown trail. I left the truck tucked behind some brush and followed the path with my gear. After about 15 minutes of walking, I saw the lake, small, surrounded by dense forest, and completely still. It didn't even look like the wind ever touched it. There was a clearing along the shore, just big enough to pitch a tent. I set up camp and spent the rest of the evening organizing things, collecting firewood, and fishing off a log that jutted into the water. I didn't catch anything, but it didn't matter. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sound was the buzzing of insects, and the last bit of sunlight made the lake look like glass. I felt better almost immediately. When night came, I sat by the fire, ate a can of soup, and stared at the flames until the cold made me crawl into my sleeping bag. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up a few times because of how quiet it was. Too quiet. At home, I always heard distant cars or the hum of appliances. Out there, once the fire died, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the distant hoot of an owl. Took some time to get used to. The next morning, I made coffee on the stove and ate granola while sitting on a flat rock by the lake. I decided to hike around the shoreline to see if there were better spots or maybe trails leading elsewhere. I brought a small backpack with water, a snack, and a whistle. The terrain around the lake was rough, with thick undergrowth, fallen logs, and uneven rocks. I moved slowly, trying to make sure I didn't twist an ankle or lose track of my location. About an hour into the hike, I found something strange. It was a large tree, split down the middle and blackened at the base like it had been hit by lightning. But the surrounding trees were untouched, and there hadn't been any storms in the area for weeks according to the forecast. Around the tree were dozens of small, broken branches stacked in what looked like a pattern, a wide circle. It didn't look natural. I crouched down and poked at them with a stick, but didn't touch anything with my hands. My first thought was that someone had camped there a while ago and made some sort of fire ring or marker, but there were no ashes, no trash, nothing else. I took a few steps back and looked around. I didn't see any footprints or signs of people, but I felt something then, a weird weight in my chest, like someone was standing behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just forest. I stood still for a while, trying to make sense of the feeling, but it didn't go away until I walked away from the spot. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just spooked because I was alone and not used to that level of silence. I spent the rest of the day reading a paperback, trying to fish again, and adding more wood to my supply. That night, I made a small fire and watched the stars come out, trying not to think about that split tree. But something changed that night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound soft but steady. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, listening. It was like a thudding or maybe footsteps, but they were irregular. Not close, not right outside the tent, but out in the woods. I couldn't tell the direction, and it stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. The next morning, I walked around the immediate area, looking for anything out of place. I didn't find tracks or signs of animals, but I did notice that one of the smaller branches I'd collected and leaned against a stump was now on the ground, broken in half. It could have been nothing. Maybe it fell or I'd stepped on it earlier without noticing, but it made me uneasy. I thought about leaving, but I also didn't want to seem paranoid. I told myself it was just forest sounds, animals moving through the brush, maybe deer. I stayed another night. That was the worst one. It was around midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, slow, deliberate. I sat up and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned down to embers, but the moon was bright enough to see silhouettes. I scanned the trees, heart pounding, holding the bear spray in one hand and the knife in the other. I stayed like that for at least 10 minutes. Then I saw movement, just a flicker at the edge of the trees, something ducking behind a trunk. Not an animal. It was too upright. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body locked. My mouth was dry, and I felt sweat run down my neck despite the cold. Whoever or whatever it was didn't come closer. After what felt like an hour, the forest was still again. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the knife beside me, the bear spray in my hand, and waited for sunrise. As soon as it was light, I packed everything up. Tent, gear, coolers, everything went back in the truck. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just got out. The drive back felt endless. Every time I turned down a stretch of road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone following, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. When I got home, I looked up reports of missing people or strange encounters in that area. I didn't find anything, just old blog posts, trail reviews, and a few articles about forest fires years back. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe just a hunter passing through who didn't want to be seen. But I know what I saw. Something upright, something aware of me, and something that didn't want me there. I haven't gone camping since. I still spend time outside, but I stay close to towns now. I'll walk forest trails, sure, but I always go with a friend, and I never go off-trail. That trip changed the way I think about solitude. I wanted peace and quiet, but what I got was something else entirely. There was no moment of confrontation, no final scare, no dramatic escape. But what happened was real, too real, and that's what makes it stick with me. Not the silence of the forest, but the feeling that I was never truly alone out there. It was the fall of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the constant buzz of life in the city. I was 32 at the time, single, and working long hours in IT. My days had become a blur of screens, deadlines, and emails that never stopped coming. I felt burnt out and restless. So when a friend mentioned a cheap rental cabin in the woods upstate, tucked near the edge of Pine Hollow Preserve, I took it as a sign. He'd stayed there once during college and said it was nothing fancy, but peaceful, just what I needed. The cabin was about 3.5 hours from where I lived in Philadelphia. I left early on a Thursday morning to avoid traffic, driving through fading towns and long stretches of empty back roads. As I got further north, the trees thickened and the air turned crisp. I rolled down my window a bit just to take it in. It was early October, and the leaves were starting to turn. Gold, orange, a few patches of bright red. The kind of scenery that looked fake if you saw it in a painting. The directions my friend gave me were pretty straightforward. The cabin was about 40 minutes past the last gas station in a town called Lasker, down a gravel road with no name, just a faded sign nailed to a tree that read Pine Hollow. I found it easily enough. The gravel crackled under my tires, and the road narrowed the deeper I went, trees crowding closer, their branches sometimes brushing the roof of my car. No cell service past Lasker, but I'd expected that. I had a paper map in the glove box just in case. The cabin came into view about a mile in, small, weathered but solid looking. It sat on a slight slope overlooking a long, narrow lake, its surface glassy and unmoving. No neighbors in sight, no other houses, just trees and silence. I parked my car, grabbed my duffel bag, and unlocked the front door with the key my friend mailed me. The place smelled like old wood and dust. It had clearly been a while since anyone stayed there. The main room had a couch, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. There was one bedroom and a tiny bathroom that had a flush toilet but no shower, just a sink. Water came from a well pump out back. No Wi-Fi, no TV. Power was solar, but there was a backup generator in the shed out back if needed. It was perfect. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, swept out cobwebs, and opened all the windows to air the place out. Made myself a simple dinner on the propane stove, canned soup and crackers, then sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees across the lake. The silence was thick, almost alive. Not oppressive, but heavy. A kind of quiet you forget exists when you live around people too long. That night, I slept like a rock. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the wind moving through the trees. I made instant coffee, sat out on the porch again, and just listened. There were no engines, no people, just nature. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in months. I spent most of the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was a trail that followed the lake's edge, overgrown but walkable. I found a couple of animal tracks in the mud, maybe deer. I took a few photos with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to upload them until I got back. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. One of the front windows was open. I was sure I'd closed them all earlier, but I figured I'd missed it, shrugged it off, and latched it shut. That night, I built a fire in the wood stove and read a paperback I'd brought. Around 9 p.m., I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned a little outside, but otherwise it was calm. I woke up just after 1 a.m. The air was cold. I pulled the blankets tighter and lay still, not sure what had stirred me. Then I heard a faint creak. Not the trees, not the wind. It was sharper, closer. I sat up and listened. Came again, this time more distinct. A floorboard, I thought, shifting. I told myself it was the cabin settling. Old houses do that. But then I heard it again. Not just one creak, but 2, 3 in a row. Like footsteps. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. The cabin had no insulation, and every sound traveled. I strained to hear more, but the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, heart thumping. Nothing, just silence again. Eventually, I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe an animal on the porch. I drifted back to sleep around 3. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I hiked a bit further along the lake, then made a sandwich for lunch. Back at the cabin, I did a slow walk around the outside, just to reassure myself. Nothing seemed out of place, until I looked at the back door. There were scratches along the wood near the handle. Not deep, but definitely there and fresh. Not the kind of weathering you see from age or storms. These were narrow, straight marks, like someone had tried to pick at the lock or pry it open with something thin. My skin crawled. I checked the door. It was locked. Still, I felt unease settle in my stomach like a stone. I told myself again it could have been animals. A raccoon maybe, or a porcupine. But something about the marks seemed deliberate. That night I couldn't relax. I kept checking the locks. The wind blew harder, and branches tapped against the windows. I left the light on in the bedroom. Just a small one, but enough to cut the dark. I kept the axe I used for chopping firewood next to the bed. I knew it was overkill, but it made me feel better. I fell asleep eventually. I woke again, this time to the unmistakable sound of the front porch boards groaning under weight. Not the wind, not some squirrel, something heavier. I didn't move. I listened, heart racing, to the steady crunch of weight shifting on old wood. A pause, another step, then another, right outside the door. I waited, barely breathing. Then nothing. Minutes passed. I stayed still. When the sun finally rose, I got up and opened the front door. The porch was empty. No sign of anything. No footprints. But I knew what I'd heard. That was the day I decided to drive into Lasker and buy a set of trail cams. I figured if it was an animal or someone, I'd know for sure. I made the drive, picked up 3 cams, batteries, and a couple of protein bars for good measure. I was gone maybe 3 hours. When I got back, something was off again. The welcome mat was slightly crooked. Not the kind of thing you'd normally notice, but I remembered setting it a certain way that morning, centered. Now it was askew. I checked the locks. Still latched. I installed the cams before sunset. One facing the back door, one overlooking the front porch, and one pointing down the trail leading to the lake. I set them to record movement. That night, I barely slept. The following morning, I checked the footage. Front porch cam, nothing. Back door cam, nothing. Trail cam, movement at 2:17 a.m. I replayed the clip. First, it was just the trees swaying. Then a figure appeared. A man. He stepped into frame slowly, half-crouched, moving with intent. He wore dark clothes, a hood pulled up, and gloves. He moved off trail and toward the trees, heading in the direction of the cabin. But the clip ended before he came close enough to be seen clearly. I watched it a dozen times. I didn't call the police. I should have. But what would I say? That a guy walked near my cabin in the woods? I didn't even have a plate number, and there was no service anyway. I could have driven back into town, but something made me stay. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. I decided I'd give it one more night. Just one. I kept the axe by the bed again, set up a few makeshift noisemakers, tin cans strung with fishing line, across the porch and near the back. Anything to give me a heads up. That night, it was quiet for hours. Then the cans rattled. Not a gust, not a bump. They rattled. I jumped up, turned on every light in the cabin, and stepped to the door with the axe in hand. I didn't open it, just stood there, heart hammering, listening. Footsteps again. This time, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I went out. The cans had been tripped, the line pulled taut. Boot prints in the dirt. Size 11 maybe, fresh, leading around the cabin, then veering off into the trees. I packed my things, left the cams where they were. I drove out of Pine Hollow without looking back, heart still pounding hours later. 2 days later, I got a call from my friend, the one who recommended the cabin. He told me to check the footage when I got home. He'd seen something on the news. A man had been arrested in a town 30 miles from Pine Hollow. They found him squatting in a hunting shack. He had tools, gloves, and a long record breaking and entering, stalking, assault. No one had known he was in the woods. No one had seen him until he tried to break into a ranger station during the night. I checked the footage again. It was him. Same build, same clothes. I was lucky. He never got. It was the summer of 2012, a year I'll never forget. I was 24 at the time, living in a small town in Oregon, far away from the busy city life I had grown tired of. I needed an escape, something to clear my mind after a tough few months of work and stress. So when a buddy of mine, Ryan, suggested a weekend camping trip, I jumped at the idea. It was just supposed to be a quick getaway, a chance to get out into the woods and disconnect from everything. I never could have imagined how the trip would change me. We decided to head to a place called Clear Creek, a remote camping spot deep in the Oregon Cascades. The place was known for its tranquility, a few scattered cabins along the creek, and lots of thick forest. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. That's what I thought, at least. We packed up our gear, set out from town around 4 p.m., and arrived at the campsite just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The drive had been peaceful, winding through old pines and past fast-moving rivers. I remember the air feeling cool, even though it was late spring, and the scent of pine and damp earth filling the car. We didn't see many other vehicles on the road, just the occasional truck, and that added to the sense of isolation. By the time we arrived, the camp was quiet, too quiet almost. It wasn't exactly the type of place where people camped in large groups. There was no campsite manager or rangers patrolling the area. It was just an open forest with a few cleared areas and fire rings. Ryan and I found a spot near the creek, far from the few cabins that dotted the land. The site was small, but it had a perfect view of the water. We set up our tent and fire pit, grabbed some firewood, and got the flames going. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The distant calls of animals, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot filled the air. It was peaceful, but there was something about the isolation that felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every now and then. We spent the first few hours talking, roasting marshmallows, and drinking some beers. I tried to push away the odd feeling I had, but it kept creeping up. After a while, the conversation lulled, and we both sat there in silence, staring into the fire. The flames flickered, and I watched as they cast long shadows on the trees surrounding us. The fire felt like a barrier between us and whatever was out there in the dark. It was around midnight when the noises started. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the woods. But as the sounds grew more distinct, I started to feel uneasy. There was something out there. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the underbrush, followed by something that sounded like branches snapping. Ryan noticed it too. He looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkness. "Yeah, sounds like someone's walking out there." We both stood up, our eyes locked on the thick woods beyond the firelight. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the trees. I don't know why, but I felt like someone or something was watching us. I kept expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows, but nothing did. The silence grew heavy, and we stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. Then, without warning, a large crash came from the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the brush. Ryan and I both jumped back, hearts racing. The noise came from just beyond the tree line, too close for comfort. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight, but I didn't want to give away our position if it was someone trying to sneak up on us. We just stood there, frozen. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an age, the sound of movement finally stopped. I don't know how long it lasted, but when it was over, the forest went silent again. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Ryan and I exchanged a look, and without saying a word, we both agreed that it was time to go inside the tent. We quickly doused the fire, grabbed our things, and zipped up the tent, leaving the outside world behind. Inside, the temperature dropped, and the shadows cast by our headlamps danced on the walls of the tent. We tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled in our stomachs. There was no talking about what had happened. We just lay there, staring into the darkness, listening for any more sounds from outside. As the hours ticked by, I could hear Ryan's breathing slow down, his deep sleep settling in. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying every little sound I had heard. I kept picturing something, someone, moving outside the tent, waiting for the right moment. Felt like we were being hunted, like we weren't alone. Eventually, around 3 a.m., the sounds returned. I heard them faintly at first. More twigs snapping, more rustling, but this time it was closer, much closer. It was as if whatever it was circling us, moving through the underbrush just beyond our tent. The sound of something heavy scraping against the ground sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched in my throat as I strained my ears, trying to figure out what was out there. Then, there was a new sound, something that froze my blood in my veins. A whisper, a soft voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was low, unintelligible, but it was unmistakable. A voice coming from the direction of the trees. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my mind raced. Who would be out there at this time of night? Why weren't they speaking clearly? Was someone trying to mess with us? I kept telling myself it had to be a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something about the way the voice came through, the way the sound echoed off the trees. It didn't feel right. I shook Ryan awake, my voice hoarse from fear. He stirred but didn't fully wake up. I grabbed his arm, shaking him harder. "Ryan, wake up, something's out there." He groggily opened his eyes, his face still half turned towards the darkness outside the tent. "What? You're freaking me out." "No, listen," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's someone out there." We both lay still, the tent trembling slightly in the wind, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, closer. It was like someone was right outside the tent now, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Ryan finally sat up, wide awake now. Okay, this isn't funny. We need to get out of here. I felt my pulse quicken. Do you have a weapon? A knife? Anything? Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and pulled out a small pocket knife, his hands trembling. I did the same, my fingers fumbling as I unsheathed my own knife. We sat there, listening to the voice grow louder and more frantic. The whispers had turned into incoherent murmurs, but it was clear something was wrong. We couldn't stay here any longer. We carefully unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet. There was no movement, no sound except for the distant hum of the wind. I peered into the darkness, but all I saw was the blackness of the trees, their silhouettes twisted by the faint light of the moon. Let's go. Now, Ryan hissed. We didn't need any more encouragement. We grabbed our bags and ran. We didn't know where we were going or how far we had to go to get away from whatever was out there, but we couldn't stay any longer. The forest felt like it was closing in around us, the trees like dark figures watching us. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the creek that we stopped, gasping for breath, our legs aching from the sprint. The only sound was the rushing water. We stood there for a few moments, not saying a word, just trying to catch our breath. After a while, we looked at each other, our faces pale with fear. We weren't alone out there, but whatever it was, whatever had been following us, whispering in the dark, it was gone. For now, we didn't go back to that campsite. In fact, we didn't go back to Clear Creek at all. The next day, we packed up and left as quickly as we could, the events of that night haunting us both. We couldn't explain what happened. There were no signs of anyone out there. No footprints, no broken branches, just the feeling of being hunted, of being watched. We never spoke about it again. Years later, I found myself back in Oregon, this time with my wife and kids. We were on a road trip through the Cascades when we passed by Clear Creek. I had to stop and take a look. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could find some kind of closure. But when I got there, the place was different. The trees were taller, the creek quieter, but there was an odd stillness in the air. And when I looked down the path leading to the camping site, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was late September when I decided to take that camping trip. The kind of trip that was meant to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. No phones, no distractions. Just me, nature, and the simple quiet of the woods. I was 28, living in a small town in Michigan, working a desk job that had started to wear on me. I'd been to this forest before, but only on day hikes. This time, I wanted to camp. I wanted to experience the full thing. Setting up a tent, cooking over a fire, and being out there in the quiet. Maybe I needed a break more than I realized, or maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Either way, I packed my gear, got in my truck, and drove a couple of hours to a place called Big Pines National Forest. I pulled up to the parking lot at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. It was colder than I expected for September, and the trees were starting to turn, their leaves showing off a little early autumn color. I could already smell the earthy, pine-scented air that I loved so much, and for a moment, I felt at peace. The trail I was heading to was a loop that stretched about 8 miles, and the campsite was right on a small creek. It was a popular spot for people who wanted to get away but still be close enough to civilization if they needed it. I knew it wouldn't be completely isolated, but that didn't matter. I was looking for solitude, not total isolation. I started the hike around 4 p.m., trying to pace myself. The trail wasn't difficult, mostly flat, and it wasn't long before I was deep into the forest, the canopy of trees overhead blocking out most of the sun. The air was cool but not cold, and with every step, I felt more and more disconnected from the hustle and bustle of the world. This was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the campsite around 6 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The spot was perfect, an open clearing next to the creek, with a fire ring already in place and a few logs set up as benches. I dropped my backpack on the ground, relieved to have made it. I set up my tent first, securing the stakes into the damp earth, then gathered some firewood from the pile nearby. The creek babbled gently behind me, and the sound was soothing. I started the fire without much trouble, something I was familiar with from my occasional camping trips. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth spread through the cool evening air. I took out a can of chili and heated it over the fire, the smell of food mixing with the pine scent around me. As I sat there, eating and watching the fire dance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I had needed. It wasn't long before the sun finally set, leaving the forest in a twilight haze. The stars began to appear one by one, slowly filling the sky with their cold, distant light. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. I felt completely alone, but not in a bad way, just alone enough to be free of everything that had been weighing on my mind. As the night deepened, I started to feel that familiar sense of unease that sometimes comes with being out in the wilderness. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more like a heightened awareness. The forest had a life of its own, and while it was beautiful, it also reminded you that you were a visitor here. This wasn't home, and the longer you stayed, the more you realized how small and fragile you were in comparison to the world around you. I tossed another log on the fire, and as the flames flared up, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I definitely saw it. Just a flash of movement, like something had darted between the trees. It wasn't a bear. I knew what they looked like from past encounters. This was smaller, more like a person's shape, but moving at a pace that seemed too fast for a human. I froze, watching the spot where I thought I saw it, but nothing else moved. The shadows played tricks in the firelight, and after a minute, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the wind shifting through the branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was one of those instincts you can't quite explain, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing up when you feel someone watching you. I couldn't decide if it was just my imagination or something more. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the darkness, but whatever it was, I started to feel more aware of every noise around me. The wind, the crackling fire, the occasional snap of a branch. Even the sound of the creek seemed louder now. I finished my dinner quickly and decided to turn in early. The night had a strange energy to it, and I figured a good night's sleep would help clear my head. I slipped into my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and settled in, leaving the fire to burn out on its own. The air inside the tent was cool but not uncomfortable, and soon enough, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual forest noises had stopped. No rustling leaves, no wind, nothing. I lay still, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the ground outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. It wasn't the noise of an animal like a deer or a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there? I didn't know if it was a person, but the possibility made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and switched it on. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting shadows inside the tent. Another crunch, this time closer. I froze, holding my breath again, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, everything was still. Too still. I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was being watched or if I was just overthinking it, but every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard a voice. It was faint, muffled by the fabric of the tent, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side. I held my breath again. The voice sounded strange, almost like it was whispering, but not to me. It wasn't a normal whisper, though. It felt off, like it was trying to stay hidden. The voice faded away, and the footsteps started again. this time retreating, moving further back into the woods. My pulse was racing now. Whoever or whatever had been out there was leaving, but the dread didn't leave with it. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was still. Too still. I checked my gear, checked the perimeter, but I couldn't find anything. No signs of anyone or anything having been there, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly creeping back in. I didn't know what had happened, but whatever it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, too unsettled to sleep, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. When morning finally came, I packed up my things quickly. The sun was up, the forest was quiet again, and I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. I had no idea who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here again. I hiked out of the woods as quickly as I could, my heart still racing. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove away without a second thought. The woods now a memory I'd never shake. I was 34 when it happened. It's been years now, but I still think about it almost every day. The sounds, the cold, the way my stomach felt when I realized how badly I had messed up. I had no one to blame but myself. I made the decisions. I packed the gear. I ignored the signs, and I almost didn't make it back. This was in the summer of 2017. I had taken 2 weeks off from my job as a mechanic in Eugene, Oregon. I was tired of people mostly, the noise of the shop, the constant ringing of the phone, the fake smiles from customers who would turn sour over the smallest things. I needed out. I had been planning a long solo hiking and camping trip for a while, and I figured July would be perfect. I didn't want the usual trails. I wasn't looking for campgrounds, RVs, or guided tours. I wanted solitude. I wanted to test myself. I wanted something rough, something raw. That's how I ended up researching abandoned fire roads and forgotten trails in the Willamette National Forest. I found a forum post from a guy who had mapped out a trail called the Valley Cutoff, a narrow, overgrown fire route from the 80s that wasn't officially on any modern maps but still existed in pieces. He said it was quiet, isolated, full of wildlife, and not traveled anymore. He even included GPS coordinates. That was all I needed. I packed everything carefully. I had a sturdy 70-liter backpack, a one-man tent, a decent sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees Fahrenheit, a hatchet, a hunting knife, waterproof matches, a stove, freeze-dried meals, iodine tablets, a life straw, a few protein bars, and a loaded .357 revolver I kept in a padded side holster just in case of bears or cougars. My phone was charged, and I brought a solar charger, even though I knew I'd have no reception once I got deep enough. I also had a paper map, a compass, and a printed version of the forum guy's directions. I wasn't reckless. I thought I was ready. The trailhead was just past a closed-off service gate about 90 minutes east of Sweet Home. I parked my truck about a half-mile down the road at a pullout, hid it well under some tree cover, and started walking. The first few days were beautiful. The air smelled clean. I saw deer, squirrels, even a black bear at a distance, too far to be a threat. The trail was narrow and rough, just like I hoped. A lot of downed trees, thorny branches that tore at my sleeves, steep inclines that made my calves burn, but it was perfect. I made camp each evening beside a stream or a flat patch of earth, cooked over the stove, and stared at the stars until I fell asleep. No people, no noise, just me and the forest. On the fourth day, I reached what I thought was the halfway point of the Valley Cutoff. There was a collapsed fire watchtower on top of a small ridge, rusted and leaning into the trees like an old skeleton. The view was amazing, though. I could see the entire valley below, dense trees for miles with a thin stream glinting in the distance. I felt invincible. That night, I camped just below the ridge near a dry creek bed. I set up the tent under a pine canopy, lit a small fire, and warmed up a pouch of chicken and rice. I remember feeling a little uneasy, like something was off, but I shrugged it off. The forest makes noises. Twigs snap, owls hoot, You get used to it. I told myself I was just tired. It was the 5th day when things started to go wrong. It started simple. I couldn't find the trail. I woke up, packed everything, and tried to follow the path the way I had marked on my map and GPS. But the trail just wasn't there. It was like it had vanished overnight. I walked in circles for an hour, thinking I had made a mistake, but I kept ending up at the same spot, the dry creek bed. I checked the map again. It didn't make sense. According to the GPS, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, but the ground in front of me was dense with brush and downed trees. The trail had been here. I had followed it to this spot, but it was gone. I didn't panic, not right away. I figured maybe a storm or a rock slide had shifted the trail. I decided to head downhill toward the stream I had seen from the ridge the day before. If I could follow that, I could eventually find a Forest Service road or a known trail. It was slow going. The terrain got worse the further I went. Thick underbrush, slippery rocks, dead branches that cracked underfoot. The slope was steeper than I remembered. I slipped more than once, scraping my palms and knees. After 3 hours, I finally reached the stream, but it was barely more than a trickle. Just muddy water between the rocks. And there was no trail, no sign of one, just endless trees. I made camp there that night, trying not to let frustration get the better of me. I had supplies. I had water. I wasn't in any danger yet. I'd rest, then try again in the morning. But that night was worse than any before. I heard something moving through the woods. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't even trying to be quiet. Heavy steps, branches snapping, then silence. Then again closer. It circled the camp. I stayed in my tent, clutching the revolver, waiting. I didn't sleep at all. Whatever it was, it never showed itself. But I knew it was there. The first light, I packed up and moved fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop. I picked a direction that looked downhill and kept walking. By noon, my legs were jelly. I started getting the sense that I was walking in loops. Every tree looked the same. I marked one with my knife, just to be sure, and 2 hours later, I passed it again. That's when panic set in. I sat down hard on a fallen log and let myself feel it. The tightness in my chest, the sweat, the heat of the sun. I was lost, totally lost. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen had gone black. Wouldn't turn on. I tried the solar charger, nothing. My phone was just as useless. The paper map didn't help either. It was too zoomed out, too broad. I couldn't tell where I was. I screamed, just once, loud enough to scare birds into flight. It echoed and then nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I was too exhausted. I rolled out my sleeping bag under a thick tree trunk and lay there with the revolver resting on my chest. The noises came again, closer this time, more than one set of footsteps, but again, nothing ever showed. Just the sound of something or someone watching. I ate sparingly the next few days. A bar here, a small pouch of food there. I rationed water and followed the trickle of the stream, which sometimes vanished entirely. My socks stayed wet. My feet blistered. I started hallucinating. Faces in the trees, whispers in the wind. But I knew they weren't real. I wasn't that far gone yet. On the 8th night, I found a clearing with an old fire ring, blackened stones arranged in a circle. It looked used, but not recently. I was too tired to care. I collapsed and fell asleep with the fire just smoldering. I woke up to movement, soft, careful steps. I held still, pretending to sleep, my hand on the revolver. I opened my eyes just a crack. I could see a figure, definitely a person, kneeling by my pack. They were wearing dark, baggy clothes, a hood pulled low. Couldn't see a face. They were going through my stuff, silent, methodical. I sat up fast and pointed the gun. The person bolted. No hesitation. Just vanished into the woods. Not a sound. I didn't fire. I don't know why. They had taken nothing. Everything was still there. But I couldn't stay. I walked until sunrise. I don't remember much of the 10th day. I started blacking out on my feet. Hunger, dehydration, exhaustion, who knows? I woke up face down in the mud more than once. I stopped caring about direction. I just wanted out. I started yelling more often, not for help, just to scream. It was mid-afternoon when I finally found the road. A real road, gravel, overgrown, but with clear tire marks. I fell to my knees and cried. I followed it for hours, limping, barely able to walk. Just as the sun dipped behind the trees, I saw a ranger station. It was old, half-rotted, clearly unused for years, but it had a satellite phone, and it worked. A chopper came the next morning. They flew me out. I weighed 19 pounds less than when I started. I had 4 infected cuts, a sprained ankle, and a fever. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. I told the ranger everything. He nodded a lot but didn't say much. Just that they didn't maintain that part of the forest anymore. Too many incidents. I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. Just said, "You're lucky to be alive." I never went back. To this day, I don't know who that was in the clearing. I don't know if they were following me the whole time or just stumbled on me. I don't know why they didn't take anything. I don't know why they never came back. But I remember how careful their hands were, how quiet they moved, like they'd done it before. Now, every time I hear a twig snap in the woods, I think of those footsteps. Every time I look at a trail map, I check for fire roads and make sure I avoid them. I still hike sometimes,